The winter of 1944 in Leyte Gulf was not a season. It was a sentence. Rain fell with a stinging hiss on twisted jungle canopy, and thick mist clung to the skeletal remains of bombed trees. Mud swallowed boots, rust ate metal, and the cries of the wounded echoed through ravines like ghostly alarms. The once proud Imperial Japanese Navy, having lost its footing in the Pacific, now limped through the Philippine interior with ragged breath and blistered feet. Corporal Daichi Nakamura led what was left of his rifle squad, 6 boys barely old enough to shave. They had marched inland for days, following no clear path, just rumors of a fallback point near a ridge overlooking the bay. Supplies were gone, morale worse. Each man carried only a rifle, some moldy rice, and the question they dared not ask aloud: were they abandoned? The jungle opened suddenly into a clearing, a ghost of wars past. Barbed wire drooped like wilting vines. Sandbags lay burst, and shell casings littered the mossy ground. At its center stood a mess tent, torn but intact, the U.S. insignia still faintly visible on the canvas flap. A hastily abandoned American outpost, perhaps evacuated during the last aerial bombardment. Daichi raised a clenched fist, and the squad fanned out. They approached with rifles raised, fingers tense, but no one was there. Only silence and the buzz of flies. Inside the tent were crates, split open by shrapnel or weather. A rusted metal stove sat cold and forgotten. One of the conscripts, Kenta, yanked open a sack and let out a cry. Food. Actual food. Canned meat, dried biscuits, and dozens of unfamiliar tins. One labeled in English, U.S. Army Instant Coffee. The squad gathered around, skeptical. The smell was strange, burnt, earthy, unlike anything they knew. Akira, the loudest of them, sneered. "Americans drink this to forget they have no soul," he muttered to quiet laughter. Masaki, more curious than brave, mimicked slurping sounds, exaggerating the act. The others joined in, mocking the enemy's strange tastes. But hunger silenced pride. They boiled water in a dented canteen over a makeshift fire, pouring it carefully over the brown powder. The liquid turned black and oily, an unnatural shade. They passed the canteen around. Daichi took the first sip. It hit like ash and fire, bitter beyond reason. He gagged. The others laughed. "This is what cowards drink," Akira declared, tossing the canteen into the mud. Yet that night was different. As the squad took shifts on watch, they noticed something odd. No one fell asleep. Masaki, usually snoring 5 minutes into his watch, stood motionless, eyes wide. Daichi, who flinched at every cracked twig in the dark, found his senses strangely alert. He could hear distant footsteps, possibly deer, possibly worse. But he didn't panic. He gripped his rifle and stared into the jungle, steady. A low fog rolled in, heavy and wet, but the squad remained sharp. Even Akira, who'd mocked the drink, admitted he felt unnaturally awake. "Maybe the poison is working," he joked, though his hands trembled less than usual. In the silence, they listened to the jungle breathe, and they didn't blink. Across the island, scattered Japanese patrols noticed a similar phenomenon. Reports from field commanders came in with a mix of disbelief and dread. The Americans were too alert, especially at night. Guards who should have been half asleep in foxholes were catching infiltrators. Night raids failed. Snipers missed. They said the Yankees had eyes like owls and nerves like wire. Some whispered about chemical enhancements. Others blamed demons. The most common rumor was stranger still. The Americans were using devil's beans, coffee, to stay awake. Initially, the Japanese laughed, but laughter turned uneasy as failure mounted. Daichi's squad heard these stories when they regrouped with another unit. A sergeant told them, half joking, "They say the Americans drink a black potion and never sleep." Perhaps it's true. No one laughed. Daichi remembered the bitterness on his tongue. The flavor was unforgettable. Not good, but unforgettable. By the third night, the squad scavenged the ruined tent again. Masaki found an unopened tin and held it reverently like a relic. No one mocked. They boiled water again, ignoring the taste. It wasn't about flavor anymore. It was about survival. The ritual became sacred. Boil, pour, sip, watch. The line between scorn and respect blurred with each swallow. What began as mockery became a quiet acknowledgement. Whatever this strange brew was, it worked. They didn't like it, but they feared how much they needed it. They laughed at the taste, but feared what it did to their minds. Back at the forward operating base carved out of the jungles near Leyte, the war wore a different face. The stench of diesel and wet canvas mingled with the constant static of radios and the low hum of distant generators. But for Private Eli Koenig, the real battleground wasn't the muddy foxholes or bullet-torn hillsides. It was the supply ledgers. Eli had grown up on the stoops of the Bronx, where hot coffee and cold winters taught him resilience. He was no soldier in the traditional sense. He didn't carry a rifle or storm beaches. But as a quartermaster clerk assigned to requisitions, he had access to everything the Army consumed, from wool socks to field radios to the small but ubiquitous tins labeled simply U.S. Army Instant Coffee. At first, the coffee shipments seemed normal, large, frequent, and spread across combat and logistics units. But by January 1945, Eli noticed an odd shift. Pallets of the caffeinated powder were being redirected, not to infantry companies or artillery battalions, but disproportionately to select intelligence and signal units stationed miles behind the front. Engineers, mechanics, even combat medics began filing complaints about short supplies. One report from a motor pool in Samar read simply, "No coffee for 9 days. Morale dropping. Mechanics jittery." Curious, Eli ran the numbers. Using an old ration ledger and some mental arithmetic his father taught him at the deli, he calculated that over 60% of the latest coffee shipment had gone to non-combat intelligence detachments. Even more strangely, some boxes weren't even accounted for in the main distribution log. They were marked with cryptic designations. OPSIG/Red, Unit 72G, Night Owl. He brought this up to his superior, Master Sergeant Clive Hannity, a grizzled logistics man who viewed curiosity as a disease. When Eli asked about the designations, Hannity didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Shut up and file the papers, Koenig. You want to stay stateside? No? Then don't go sniffing around what doesn't need sniffing." The rebuke was standard, but the look in Hannity's eye wasn't. It wasn't anger, it was caution. Across the camp, Lieutenant Ernest Wade had never met Eli Koenig, but their paths were circling the same truth. Wade was a wiry, underslept signals officer whose team intercepted and decoded Japanese transmissions across the central Philippines. It was grueling work, 8-hour night shifts hunched over crackling headphones, fingers twitching over Morse transcribers, minds clouded with static and fatigue. Until recently, Wade's crew had struggled. Nighttime decoding required concentration beyond what any man could normally sustain. Errors were common. Fatigue was constant. But since November, something had changed. The mistakes dwindled. The team's intercept speed improved. Entire enemy transmissions were being captured, decoded, and relayed before Japanese units even finished their field maneuvers. Wade, no fool, began investigating. It started with one corporal, then another. When he asked what helped them stay sharp, the answer was always the same: coffee. Not just the standard issue stuff. This came from sealed tins marked Ration Type C/Night Grade. It had a darker tint, dissolved faster, and came with a caffeine wallop that turned your pupils into saucers. They called it Black Light. One of his technicians, a former pharmacist from Chicago, explained in hushed tones that this variant wasn't just stronger, it was chemically modified. They boiled off some of the oils, made it faster acting. More immediate uptake through the stomach lining. You get wired in under 4 minutes. Wade was stunned. He asked where it came from. The tech shrugged. It just shows up in the crate. Nobody asks. Digging deeper, Wade found a report from Fort Detrick, a research center he barely knew existed. The report, dated 6 months earlier, detailed an experimental study on neural stimulation under combat conditions. The key compound? Caffeine, but not in pill form, in liquid, in ritual, in habit. The conclusion was damning. Soldiers who consumed high doses of coffee showed marked improvement in cognitive speed, reflex response, and memory retention. In war, it gave men minutes, and in minutes, battles are won. But the report had been shelved. No command directive ever came down. Wade submitted an inquiry. It came back redacted. Another was marked, "Do not pursue." Eli Koenig, meanwhile, couldn't shake what he had seen. One day, under the pretense of moving inventory, he opened a crate bound for a remote comms detachment near Tacloban. Inside were dozens of silver tins, each stamped with a blue eagle and a tag. Psych, Stim, C-grade. He took one. Just one. Late that night, by candlelight, he brewed it. The effect was electric. His heart pounded. His vision sharpened. And for the next 6 hours he wrote in his notebook, tracing a theory no one else seemed to grasp. "This isn't coffee. This is doctrine," he scribbled. "The officers think it's a comfort supply." But the guys at Detrick knew. They knew what it could do. And someone high up, someone smarter than Hannity or Wade, decided to test it out anyway. Not in labs, in jungles. He flipped the page and underlined a final thought. They don't get it. We're weaponizing the cup. While the brass called it comfort, the front line called it fuel, and the truth lay in between. The monsoon rains fell in sheets over the mountains of Cebu, turning every trail into a path of mud and misery. The year was 1945, and the war in the Pacific had become a brutal test of attrition, one where the jungle, disease, and fatigue wore down the strongest of men faster than bullets. For Sergeant Hiroshi Okabe of the Imperial Japanese Army, the mountain pass ahead represented not just a strategic position, but survival. Okabe had once been a schoolteacher in Osaka. He was known for his precise handwriting and quiet authority. Now, with his uniform soaked and boots rotting from within, he led what remained of his shattered company, mostly boys conscripted in the last desperate months. They had retreated for weeks, chased by American reconnaissance units that seemed to Hiroshi not quite human. It was during one of these weary nights that Hiroshi crouched behind a crumbling stone wall and watched the latest ambush unfold. Rain blurred the trees and softened the sounds of death, but the flashes of M1 carbines cut through the dark like lightning. His men had barely taken up defensive positions before the American scouts struck. Quick, efficient, relentless. The Japanese forces had become too slow, too drained. They were ghosts long before they died. After the firefight ended and the Americans vanished back into the jungle, Hiroshi paced the blood-slicked ground. His second-in-command, Corporal Michio Tanabe, leaned against a tree, pale and shivering. "How do they not sleep, Hiroshi-san?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They fight like they've been awake for days." That question gnawed at Hiroshi. He had seen it again and again. The Americans moved at night. Their eyes didn't glaze over. Their hands didn't tremble from exhaustion. It wasn't just discipline, it was something else. The answer came in the form of a captured U.S. Marine, pulled from a thicket by 2 of Hiroshi's scouts. The prisoner was young, lean, face bruised and bloodied from the skirmish. But he grinned. Even as blood trickled down his chin, even as ropes bit into his wrists, he held himself with unsettling calm. In broken Japanese, he muttered only one word. "Coffee." Hiroshi knelt before him. "What did you say?" "Coffee," the Marine repeated. "Lots of it." Hiroshi stood, disgusted. "Poison for the weak," he muttered and turned away. But the words stayed in his mind. That night the march continued, another relocation to avoid encirclement. But his men could barely lift their feet. They stumbled, some collapsing outright. Spirits were frayed, and eyes were glassy with fatigue. The jungle offered no mercy, only damp rot and whispers of unseen enemies. In his satchel, Hiroshi carried the tin they had confiscated from the prisoners' gear. It smelled acrid, foreign. The label read, U.S. Army Instant Coffee Type C Ration. It had been mocked when first discovered, passed around and sneered at. But desperation is the great equalizer. He ordered water boiled in a battered aluminum pot and poured in the dark powder. Steam rose, bitter and pungent. He held the canteen cup to his lips, hesitated, then drank. It hit quickly, not a surge, but a sharpening. The jungle's sounds grew crisper. The fog in his head cleared slightly. His heartbeat steadied, then picked up. He turned to his men. "Drink it. All of you." Most refused. "We are not like them," Tanabe said, shaking his head. "That's American filth." But a few obeyed. Desperation and instinct overrode pride. They drank in silence, like swallowing shame. They made it to the next checkpoint before sunrise. Rain still fell, but their eyes stayed open. Their rifles didn't slip from their shoulders. When dawn broke, they found the others, those who had refused the drink, slumped in the mud, necks twisted, bullet holes clean and silent, ambushed in their sleep. From that moment, Hiroshi no longer called it poison. Miles away, in the U.S. Central Command building in Manila, a different battle unfolded. Lieutenant Gabriel Klein, a young medic from Des Moines, typed up his latest observation. He had been tracking reaction time in combat units over the past 3 months, comparing those who had consistent access to caffeine versus those without. The difference was shocking. Units with limited or no coffee had higher casualties in ambushes, slower evacuation speeds, and more friendly fire incidents. He compiled the data, added his notes, and submitted the report to Medical Command. The title read, Cognitive Delay Under Combat Stress, Caffeine as Preventative Stabilizer. It was marked non-essential and routed to a filing cabinet in a rear office no one visited. Gabriel sighed. The war was changing. No one seemed to notice. In the jungle, Hiroshi noticed. He now rationed the American coffee like gold. He drank it before patrols. He gave it to scouts. He stopped calling it weakness. His men still didn't speak of it openly. It was shameful to survive by swallowing the enemy's brew. But even Tanabe, pale and limping, eventually asked for a sip. The American scouts hadn't stopped. But now Hiroshi's men started to see them first, hear them, respond faster, even win skirmishes. One night, as Hiroshi crouched beneath the canopy sipping the last warm swallow of coffee, he whispered to no one, "We may lose the war, but I will not lose my men to sleep." Across the Pacific, generals argued over maps. But in the steaming jungles of Cebu, the line between tradition and survival boiled in a tin cup. The strongest weapon in the jungle wasn't a rifle. It was a cup they refused to understand. On a wind-bitten cliff above the Pacific coast of Okinawa, the waves thrashed restlessly, and a cold drizzle settled over a half-forgotten Japanese naval outpost. The concrete buildings bore scars from previous skirmishes, their antennae bent, their paint chipped by salt and gunfire. Inside a dim signal room, lit only by flickering bulbs and the static green glow of monitoring equipment, Ensign Haruto Ishikawa sat hunched over a receiver. A chemistry student turned reluctant code analyst, Haruto had been conscripted not for his loyalty to the emperor, but for his aptitude in science. That morning, he intercepted a strange Allied broadcast. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't even urgent. The frequency was one typically reserved for humanitarian channels, and the message itself was mundane at first glance, a Red Cross supply manifest, itemizing rations for American prisoners of war held across several Japanese-occupied zones. Haruto squinted at the list, translating quickly in his mind. Canned meats, powdered milk, medical gauze, expected items. But one line struck him as peculiar. Instant coffee, Type C, 3 tins per prisoner per month. He frowned. Coffee? In war zones stretched for supplies, why was this luxury being emphasized for prisoners? Haruto turned to his superior, Lieutenant Commander Sato, a stern man whose trust in tradition exceeded his trust in technology. He presented the decoded list and asked, "Sir, why would they prioritize coffee for prisoners?" Sato chuckled without looking up from his cigarette. A trick, symbolism. Americans cling to comfort. Coffee is their blanket. Don't waste your mind on Western decadence. But Haruto's mind didn't let it go. In his weeks stationed at the outpost, he had monitored dozens of prisoner reports and field intercepts. The Americans were persistent, clever, sometimes impossible to predict. Still, something was nagging at him. He went through old logs and incident reports, and a troubling correlation began to emerge. Every major escape attempt from POW camps over the past 6 months had occurred within days of these Red Cross deliveries. At first, he thought it coincidence. But then, reviewing encrypted Allied messages that had been decoded too late to matter tactically, he noticed a pattern. Encrypted orders cross-referencing the exact dates of coffee shipments. He even saw an intercepted field memo between 2 Allied officers referencing signal potential at hot drop site with beverage morale booster. He wasn't sure what it meant exactly, but he knew it wasn't about comfort. The coffee had become a symbol, yes, but not just of home. It was a gateway, a currency, a tool. Meanwhile, across the island in a POW camp nestled between limestone ridges and overgrown banyan trees, U.S. Marine Sergeant Clive Peterson was living a parallel story. Captured during a coastal defense mission months earlier, Clive had earned a fragile respect among some of the Japanese guards for his discipline and his silence. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and never gave more than name, rank, and serial number. But he watched, listened, waited. Like the others, he had received his monthly ration tin marked U.S. Army Instant Coffee, courtesy of the Red Cross. Some men hoarded it, others traded it among themselves or mixed it into muddy rainwater to recapture even a whisper of normalcy. But Clive had a different plan. One of the guards, a conscript from the northern prefectures of Honshu, had a weakness for Western things. He had once accepted a cigarette from Clive in exchange for an extra blanket. Over the following weeks, Clive nurtured this connection with quiet precision. When the next coffee shipment arrived, Clive split his ration and carefully packed half into a hand-folded leaf wrapper. One night, under cover of darkness and rain, he offered the bundle to the guard. The young man sniffed it and smiled faintly. "Good trade?" Clive asked softly. The guard hesitated, then nodded. He gestured for Clive to follow him, but only a few steps toward a storage shed behind the latrines. Inside, hidden beneath a broken floor panel, was an old radio transmitter. Long abandoned, its battery nearly drained, but functional. The guard, eyes darting, handed Clive a stub of pencil and a folded page torn from a Japanese ration log. Clive worked quickly, scrawling coordinates and a brief encoded message. He had memorized the Allied cipher months earlier. When he was done, he looked to the guard, who hesitated again, then tapped the transmitter switch. The message went out. 30 seconds. No more. Clive gave a silent nod of thanks. The guard only said, "No second time." Back at the Okinawa Naval Outpost, Haruto logged a strange spike on a secondary frequency. Too short to be a broadcast. Too precise to be background. He triangulated the signal, then double-checked the coordinates. It came from within their own controlled sector. He brought the data to Sato again. "Sir, there was an unauthorized radio emission. Here, from the Shuri Valley camp." Sato barely glanced. "Probably a storm echo, or one of our own patrols. But it was exactly 37 seconds. Sir, that's not natural." Sato waved him off. "We are not chasing ghosts, Ensign. File your report and return to code sheets." Haruto filed the report, but he also marked the coordinates in his private logbook. 3 days later, at 0400 hours, parachutes opened silently over the southern edge of Okinawa. A daring assault team of U.S. airborne rangers, guided by coordinates no Japanese commander believed worth monitoring, descended like shadows. The camp guards were overwhelmed before they understood what was happening. Not a single American prisoner was lost. Clive Peterson was the last to board the evac chopper. He looked back once, then tucked a leaf-wrapped bundle of coffee into his breast pocket. Back at the outpost, Haruto read the liberation report with a sinking feeling. His own coordinates. His ignored warning. The pieces clicked with chilling clarity. He shut the report and whispered to himself, "They thought it was a drink of luxury until it became the map to their undoing." Thousands of miles from the front lines, nestled in the frostbitten flatlands of Illinois, the Maxwell coffee plant hummed with industrial purpose. Its long, red brick walls loomed like fortresses against the snow, smoke coughing steadily from twin stacks that marked it as both a monument to wartime labor and a sanctuary for its forgotten workers. Among those inside was William Barrow, a quiet man in his early 30s whose world was wrapped in silence. Deaf since childhood, William had learned to listen with his hands, the subtle thrum of vibration through the floor, the rhythmic grind of machinery, the pulse of American industry beating beneath his boots. Every day began the same. He rose before dawn in his one-room apartment above the train depot, dressed in overalls still tinged with yesterday's coffee dust, and walked the 3 blocks to the factory. The Maxwell plant was alive by 6 a.m., with forklifts darting like beetles, steam pipes hissing, and conveyor belts rattling like bones in motion. For many workers, it was grueling but bearable. For William, it was holy. His older brother Nathan had died during the fall of Bataan in 1942, a name now muttered in reverence or rage depending on who you asked. William never heard the telegram delivered to his parents, never heard the knock, but he saw their faces, felt the shiver that passed through their home. Since that day, William had made it his quiet mission to join the war effort in the only way he could. The draft didn't want him. The Navy rejected him. But the war machine needed hands more than ears. William worked the caffeine line. It wasn't glamorous. Giant drums of raw beans arrived from the port at Galveston, steamed and chemically stripped of oils, then pressurized to extract caffeine. His job was to grind the residue into soluble powder and pack it into tins labeled Instant Ration Type C. By the end of every shift, his hands were stained dark as clay and smelled of scorched metal and earthy bitterness. He took pride in it. Each tin, in his mind, was a weapon. Each shipment a whisper of vengeance. But there was more to the factory than the production floor. On the 5th level, a restricted mezzanine behind a padlocked steel door, experimental blends were produced under military contract. Few knew of it. Fewer understood its purpose. What had started as a civilian supplement had become a pharmacological project. Maxwell scientists had teamed with Army researchers to create a hyper-concentrated caffeine variant. They called it J13 internally. Soldiers called it Jitterbrew. Jitterbrew was never meant for the infantry. Its target users were long-range bomber crews who had to stay alert for up to 72 hours without rest. The dose was precise, the risks known. Hallucinations, cardiovascular strain, paranoia. But for the high-altitude bombers flying over the Pacific and Europe, the trade-off was survival. Every crate was to be clearly marked and routed directly to air bases, until one wasn't. In March of 1945, a clerical error, perhaps a mistyped shipment code, perhaps the exhaustion of a logistics officer managing 4 war fronts, rerouted a batch of J-13 crates to the 28th Infantry Division, stationed on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima. By the time anyone noticed, the tins had already been distributed into the field. Soldiers drank it without hesitation, mistaking it for standard ration coffee. The transformation was immediate. Within 12 hours, reports surfaced of men unable to sleep or sit still. Patrol units refused rotation. Medics couldn't explain the increased heart rates or irrational bravado. Some soldiers claimed to hear the jungle breathing. Others said they could see the shadows of enemy snipers before they moved. The commanding officer, a Major Flanders, wrote in his journal, "My men are not tired. They are unraveling." On the third night, under cover of darkness and drenched in tropical rain, a battalion surged up the cliffs with the ferocity of demons. They cleared enemy positions thought impregnable, but several collapsed afterward, mumbling incoherently or suffering violent tremors. One platoon dug trenches and then buried their own rifles, convinced they were being watched through the metal. Another reported hearing Morse code in the cries of native birds. A week later, command issued a quiet recall of the coffee tins, citing contamination. Internal reports filed the case under environmental fatigue and possible tropical psychosis exacerbated by unknown stimulant exposure. The name J13 never appeared. No punishment was issued, no apology offered. The war couldn't afford pause. The bodies of the dead were tagged and shipped. The survivors were folded into other units. Back in Illinois, William never knew. He continued his work without break, grinding beans, sealing tins, and watching shipment crates disappear into railcars headed east. If anyone from Iwo Jima returned with tales of the strange brew, those stories never reached the Maxwell plant. The war was too big for such ripples. William, deaf to headlines and unschooled in military nuance, just kept grinding. The ghost of Nathan, his brother, lingered in the steam, his voice imagined in every hiss of pressure valves. William didn't need to hear it to understand. He imagined Nathan smiling each time a tin left the line, a silent weapon against a brutal enemy. And so he worked, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, fingers trembling from vibration, lungs full of roasted dust, a martyr of machinery. He never heard the war end. The war machine didn't care what you heard, only what you shipped. August 15th, 1945. The sun had not yet broken over Tokyo's shattered skyline, and the once proud imperial capital lay blanketed in the gray haze of ruin. Smoke lingered in alleys where buildings once stood. Broken bridges stretched across rivers like ribs exposed to the air. Soldiers in tattered uniforms patrolled in silence, more specters than sentinels. The war was over, but no one dared say it aloud yet. In what remained of the Meiji government complex, a temporary conference room had been fashioned out of the only building still standing with its roof intact. The windows had no glass. The walls still bore the cracks of recent tremors, some from the earth, others from the sky. There were no flags, no banners, only men in quiet uniforms and the weight of history in the air. Lieutenant General Masaru Onoda entered slowly. He walked with a stiff spine and a face carved from stone, but his eyes revealed exhaustion far deeper than sleep could cure. Once an esteemed strategist for the Imperial Army, Onoda had become the reluctant face of a nation brought to its knees. His boots stepped over cracked tiles, their polished leather dulled by ash and dust. Across the long, makeshift table sat the American envoys, led by Colonel Thomas Yates. Yates was a tall man, gaunt from stress but not weak. He wore his uniform like armor but kept his hands exposed, soft-palmed and calloused only by pen and paper. He had once studied engineering, then law. War had made him a diplomat by necessity, not choice. Onoda took his seat. No one spoke for a full minute. Outside, the wind rolled in from the south, carrying the smell of sea salt and smoke. Yates cleared his throat. From a canvas satchel, he produced a small metal tin. Polished silver, modest in size, the label, barely visible, read, U.S. Army Instant Coffee, Type B ration. He pushed it gently toward Onoda, a peace gesture. Onoda's gaze didn't drop. He stared at Yates for several seconds. Then, finally, his eyes shifted down to the tin. The small, absurd object sat like a relic between empires. "You bomb us with steel," Onoda said, voice low and almost hollow, "and soothe us with beans?" Yates did not flinch. "We offered fire when ordered. I offer this by choice, silence again." Onoda opened the tin. The scent hit him before he realized he was breathing it in. Rich, dark, slightly acidic. He hadn't smelled real coffee in years. The Imperial Army had long since run out of beans. His last cup had been in Manila, 1942, brewed from scorched rice husks. A junior aide brought a kettle, boiled over a charcoal stove. No ceremony, no porcelain. Just a battered steel cup and a steady pour. The water hissed as it hit the powder. Steam curled into the air like smoke from a long silenced rifle. Onoda wrapped his hands around the cup. He didn't sip right away. Instead, he stared into the dark liquid, seeing not a beverage but a reflection. His own face. Aged, hardened, tired. Then, slowly, he raised it to his lips. The bitterness struck first. Sharp and metallic, unlike the subtle brews of Kyoto's tea houses. But it was also clean, pure. No grit, no cloying sweetness. There was something strangely bracing about it, like cold river water. A memory surfaced, uninvited and unbidden. Chicago, 1931. Onoda, just 22, seated on a wooden bench beside the river. A light coat around his shoulders. Leaves falling like embers in the autumn wind. He had studied engineering at the University of Chicago under a rare scholarship granted to promising international students. He had lived with a host family, the Morgans, who taught him the ritual of morning coffee. They drank it slowly, without sugar. Mr. Morgan would read the paper. Mrs. Morgan would hum old jazz tunes from the kitchen. Onoda would sit in silence, absorbing their peace, their ease, their trust in the morning. He had not thought of that in over a decade. He lowered the cup. "Colonel Yates," Onoda said, voice steadier now, "do you know what this tastes like?" Yates said nothing. "It tastes like when I was a student." Before any of this, before soldiers and fire and islands soaked in blood, the other Japanese officers said nothing. One coughed, the sound echoing against the broken walls. Later, when the envoys departed, Onoda remained behind. He sat in the same chair, staring at the tin. A fly buzzed near the rim of the empty cup. His aide, Sergeant Mizuno, entered and waited. "Sir," he finally said, "shall I burn the documents?" "No." "Shall I summon the radio operator?" Onoda nodded. That night, a shortwave transmission was sent to Allied Command. Coordinates, schedule, formal acceptance of terms. Japan would surrender. Decades later, in an interview with a journalist from the Asahi Shimbun, Mizuno would recount that day. "It wasn't the coffee," he quoted the general as saying. "It was the memory it carried." And in that moment, for just one man, the war ended, not with signatures or ceremonies, but with something older than hatred, remembrance. Sometimes surrender begins not with a bullet, but with a taste too human to hate. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of culture shock, humility, and the small moments that bridge divides even in times of conflict. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire understanding, empathy, and respect across cultures.